Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at a couple of C# tricks that can be really handy in Unity, and some of these are things that will only work in newer versions of Unity because they're newer things that are there in the C# language, but they're things that can make our lives a lot easier. So let's dive on in and take a look. So I'm going to create a couple of scripts that we'll be able to be using to demonstrate these. Now, the first thing I want to actually look at is some stuff with properties. So I'm going to create one that I'll call property demo, and we'll just put that on an empty game object. Also called property demo. So what we're used to seeing is if we go and want something to be visible in the inspector, we're used to, okay, well, we can have public int visible variable 1. And we're used to also seeing, okay, well, we can, if we wanted that private or protected, we could do visible variable 2. So we're used to that. But one of the things that we might want to do is we might want something to be publicly gettable, but only privately settable and still in the inspector. So that is something where we would often use a property. And for that, if we did something like this, visible variable 3, and I set up so it's got our usual logic there, and we might default it to 10, I will currently see visible variable 1 and 2 in the inspector, and I can modify and work with those, but I can't do that with visible variable 3. But a thing that's been more recently added into C# and that Unity has got some good support for now, so I'm for reference in 2021.2.16. From memory, anything in the 2021.2 series definitely will have this, and I think possibly also 0.1. But what I can actually do is, so when we set up a property like this, behind the scenes, there is usually a backing field for a property that gets created. And so just adding serialize field here won't work. If I do that and go back to the inspector, well, nothing changes because I've applied this to the property, not to the backing field for it. So what I can actually do is if I do field serialize field, that says this attribute, apply it to the backing field. And if I save that and then go to Unity, we now can see visible variable 3. So I can edit that, and we can confirm that that's definitely there. If I change scenes, so if I set up another scene here, just so we make sure that nothing's still in memory, level 2, and I'm just going to switch to that. And so we go back, can see, yep, has definitely serialized it. Now in an older version of Unity, it will still potentially work, so depending upon how old you go. In some older versions of Unity, it will just, if it's old enough, it will just not work. But there's a range there where it will work, but the actual name here will look kind of messy because it'll actually be the auto-generated name for the backing field. But in the newer versions of Unity, it just shows the variable name based off the property name as we expect. So that's something that can be really handy. So that's great, a really useful thing. So we can apply properties like of that. In terms of other things we can then check, well, okay, we're used to applying sometimes ranges. So what happens if we do like a range 0, 10 on this? So there, it doesn't work. because it's not valid, it's only valid on fields, so I can't put it afterwards. Can I put it here though? So let's check. When I go back to Unity, and yes. So any of those things where the attributes, we'd normally apply them to the variable, we can use them still with properties. We just have to add in this extra little bit to indicate field so that it knows what it's applying to. So it applies it to the backing field, not to the actual particular variable itself. So that can be really handy. Gives us the advantage of sort of a bit of a meld between these two, because what I've previously often done is I would then do things like, okay, well, visible variable 2, I'd end up calling it like this, and then I would do something where I have, you know, int visible variable 2, and just map that to that one. This setting up a property in this syntax is equivalent to something that is publicly gettable and privately settable. So I could do like of that. That's what I used to have to do. But it's much easier to be able to do that in one line. Keeps my code shorter. So we're not having, so I get the advantages of something that can be publicly gettable. I can set it in the inspector. I can't edit it in other classes, which is great. And it's also less code that I'm typing in, which is always a good thing. Smaller code, lesser amounts of code, always great, especially when we're managing to achieve that while also achieving something that gives us good code robustness. Like part of the reason we have things at times publicly gettable and privately settable is so that we have that greater robustness and control. Now this is only going to work with these ones where, like of this style, where it auto-generates the backing property. If I had fully expanded out versions of the get and the set, that wouldn't actually work. So it's only going to be for ones like of this, but that's still a pretty large number of variables I often find, so a very handy thing. So that's a cool thing that we can be doing with properties. So let's take a look at another cool thing that we can be doing with arrays and lists. So I'm going to attach this on, just again, array and list demo. I just want to keep these all nicely contained. So, okay, I'm going to set up a list here. And I won't make it public. I'm going to have a list int values. We'll set that up. And let's also have an array int values. We'll call this int values list and int values array. And this one can be a new int. Say there's 5 in it, and I'm just going to 10, 20, 30. It's weird for it to go and try and jump ahead like that, but sure, okay. So there we go, we chuck in a few values, our int values list. I'm going to just add in 5 ones. So while int values list.count is less than 5, we will add in random range from 0 to 100. So just populated some data in there. So say I wanted to grab the last value of either of these. What we're used to often doing is going, okay, well, I can go int values list, and I can go int values list count -1, and I might log that out. So I might be doing something like this. And that works. It means we're typing in a lot. And we have to remember that every time. We have to remember the -1. There's another way of doing it that we can do now in C#. So I can do debug log int values list _1. These two lines are identical. So line A, line B, lines A and B are the same. So we'll prove that it works. I'll run this and we'll see, confirm that yes, it definitely does work. But this is a syntax that we now have access to in C#. Again, newer versions of Unity. So we can see, we do see the exact same value. We can also go values other than 1 there. So say I went and did a debug log int values array caret 2. Now I'm expecting this to output 40. So we'll run it, and we get 40 as the output. So we can actually step back an arbitrary amount. So it gives us a really easy shortcut way of being able to access something from the end of an array. Now, what if we give a value that is too large? Let's see what happens, because we know what happens the other direction. We get index out of range errors. Do we get an index out of range error if we try and go too far off the front? And the answer is yes. So all of our exception logic still applies, so that's really handy. So we can use a number there. How complex a thing can we get away with? What if I did a debug log, and let's put our offset is 1. Will it let me do that? An int values array, caret, and offset. It's not showing any errors. Does it actually work though? Does it give me the correct value back? So if I run it, and we can see it does. So we could be passing in a variable here. What if I did maths on that? So what if I did something where, okay, I want to actually do offset plus 1. Will that work? So not just a number or a variable, but something where I'm actually doing a calculation on it and I want it to evaluate that calculation. And again, the answer is yes. So I can use a variable. Let's see how complex I can go. Can I use a function? Get offset. And we'll make it that this takes a parameter. And all it's going to do is return that offset. So let's see if that works. Can I do a debug log int values array, caret, get offset 1. Again, I'm not seeing any syntax errors, so that's a positive sign. And this is something, when we're working with code, don't be afraid to experiment. You know, unless you're working with code that is touching things like file system or registry or very low-level hardware access, the most you're likely to cause to happen is maybe a null reference exception or Unity to crash. Maybe in an extreme case, you might be able to cause your OS to reset. That's pretty hard to do though. Generally, the most you might cause is the application to crash. So there's not a lot that can go wrong. And as long as you're making sure, okay, you don't have something really important that is unsaved open at the same point in time as you're doing the experimentation, the risk is pretty low. So experiment with things like this with bits of code. It's a really great way of learning and discovering how the different things work. So let's test this. Does it work with the function? And the answer is yes. So it gives us a really, really easy way of accessing stuff that is offset based upon the end of the array or list. So really handy for those containers that are accessed by an index. We were able to go and do stuff like this because that works with the array. If I put in instead list, I'll find all of this stuff works just as well with the list. which we should expect. They behave very similarly. And we can see, yep, the data's coming through entirely fine. So, okay, we can access things using offsets that have got variables. So that's a couple of cool things. Let's have a look at some more handy stuff. The next thing to take a look at is something called string interpolation. So what I'm going to do, and if you've seen me working in recent videos, you'll see I'm using it a bunch. So string interpolation demo. Again, this is a newer feature in C#. And so string interpolation demo. So this is something that makes it a little bit easier, or more than a little bit easier, a fair bit easier for doing complex expressions where you're assembling a string. This can make things a lot easier. So let's say with this, I wanted to public int value, and we might make that 537. There we go, that'll work. And if I wanted to display that in a string with other stuff surrounding it, the way that I often would have previously written that is I could write that, okay, well, a debug log, the value is plus value. So that's one way of doing it. That's a very manual way of assembling it. There is also the debug log format options, where with the debug log format, you end up with something that looks like the value is, and we put value. So we can check those two. We want to make sure that we see both of those appearing. Now I'm going to turn off the array and list one, just because that has a lot of output that we want to cull out of the set of stuff. So we can see we need to make sure indices here is 0 based. So we'll start that again. And we should see the same message from both. So we do. So, okay, got debug log, we've got the format version of things. We can also use string interpolation. Now what changes is before the opening quotation mark, we put a $sign, and then we say the value is, and braces. You'll notice how the color immediately changes. That's because the braces are then able to capture something, and so they can capture a variable that is going to be visible in that scope. They can also access more than variables, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But what we want to check is and confirm is that we get the exact same output in each case, which we do. So we could go further, and we could go, okay, well, the random number is random range from 1 to 7. So we can run functions. We can also format information. So when we display the data, we can actually control how it gets formatted. So we could do something like, okay, well, debug log, the value is, and I could do a random range from 0f to 1f, and then I can actually put in any of my normal format specifiers. So these are our string format specifiers. So I could put something like 0.0. And then when I run this, let's see what we get for output. So in C, number is 1, and that, because I had a format specifier, it actually appears as 0.1. I can also do pretty much any calculation here. I could be running functions, things like that. The main thing that you often find that you do want to watch for is the other value is you want to make sure that you put the stuff in brackets if you're doing a calculation generally. So if I did 5 plus random range 1 to 100. That's something where I do the calculation typically in parentheses. That just avoids it thinking that it needs to do any formatting, so it just ensures that it's fully evaluated before it then goes and does any of the actual insertion into the string. So you can see it's worked. So anywhere that you would use a string, you can turn that into an interpolated string with just putting the $sign beforehand. So it doesn't require any special support from the functions, just requires that you're using a recent enough version of Unity, which any of the ones pretty much easily from the last year, definitely, this is going to work in. So anything where you would have used a string, you can use an interpolated string. So there's not anything extra that needs to be done. So if you're writing your own functions that have strings, to pass an interpolated string to them, you don't do anything different other than pass an interpolated string. The actual function is exactly the same. So really handy way of being able to construct complex debug messages, or it might be variables. So I've used this style before for things like where I need to construct a URL. It makes it really easy for setting it out. You're writing less code. It's also a little bit clearer to read. And the variables are going in at the exact point. Stuff like of the format versions, it is very easy for it to end up, you get the numbers wrong, as we saw. For things where it's the very manual approach, it gets really messy getting a sense of what the string is going to look like because you've got extra quotation marks, so spacing gets tricky. Whereas the interpolated string one, it's nice and clear exactly how it's going to look, and the syntax is quite straightforward. So really handy, highly recommend it. And so then there's one final thing that I want to take a look at. The final thing I wanted to look at was some additions and things that we can be doing with switches. So I'm going to create another game object, switch demo, and we'll attach a little script onto that. Switches demo. And it's a little bit grumpy at me because it's warning that the project path, because it has the hash symbol in it. So that will be something I might change just in case it runs into any issues for folks. So switches, we're used to seeing, okay, let's do a dice roll as a random range. Let's assume we've got a D20. So we roll from 1 to 21. And okay, so we're used to saying, okay, well, say I want to switch based upon that. And if I wanted to have something cover a range of values, so I might have something that goes, okay, well, for 1, I want you to do this. And it might be for 1 to 5, it does the exact same thing. So we're used to saying I could lay out all the cases, I could let them then cascade together. In, again, newer versions of C#, one of the things that I could do is say I wanted something to happen for all of the cases where it's less than or equal to 5. I can do case less than or equal to 5. Debug log, outcome 1. And a break. Let's say I want something where, okay, well, that's handled for if it's less than 5. I could then have a specific case for, let's say, for 20. And that would be critical outcome. Now, if I wanted to have something different for 1, I could have debug log, critical fail. So we've got that. We've got critical success. And I can then do some other ranges. So I could say, okay, well, if it's less than, but not equal to 10, that might be outcome 2. And I will actually log out the dice roll. Again, using the interpolated strings from before. Dice roll was That's good. So we've got the range there, and so we've got a range from 10 through 19 that we haven't covered. So this being able to use these expressions here is something that's new in C#. And then default, we'll just go for a debug log, and we'll say, in this case, default. So, okay, we should expect, based upon the dice roll, to see different things. And just like with other cases, we could also have things cascade. So you can have it that, okay, this critical success one I might put up here, but then I could have outcome 2 also covers if it is greater than 18. So that means this, it'll have that outcome if it was less than 10 or it was greater than 18. But because we've handled 1 and 20 earlier, those will exit out at that point. So we can test and see how that goes. So we can see the value, we've got the dice roll was 15, which came up with default, which we'd expect. And I'm going to turn off these other ones just so we can only see its output. So we'll run it again. It was 9, so we got outcome 2, which we expect. Whereas before for 15 we got default. So we can see it's giving us, 8 gives outcome 2, and we could inject specific values as something where if you were testing it. So there we go, 18, also default because our test was greater than 18, not that it was greater than or equal to. So we can do simple expressions here, and that saves having to list, because the other alternative for this would be we use a bunch of if statements, or we use a whole bunch of case statements, and that gets really messy really fast. Doing lots and lots of case statements like that, easy to make a problem, easy to mess things up. Whereas with this, we can again, that thing of the less code we write, the better. The smaller amount of code you've got, the less surface area there is for errors, for bugs to hide, to occur in. It's also the smaller amount of stuff you need to look through to try and track down those bugs. So anything we can do to minimize the amount or the space of amount of bugs or the space that bugs could hide in is good. And anything that makes it easier for us to keep more of what's happening in our head, the better. This allows us to keep the code shorter, which is always safer. And it means we spend our time adding in functionality and making it better, not implementing very, very lots of stuff where we're having to write huge amounts of code. So anything that saves us writing code is good. So that gives us a really cool thing that we can be doing with switches. That was a cool addition that we have with switch statements. But there is also something that we now have support for in C# called switch expressions. And these are really handy for where you have things that might be needing to do a translation. So for example, let's say I have a public enum e direction, and I might have north, east, south, and west. And I want to turn that into a vector. How I would previously have had to do that is, okay, I could have a function, and that function could then check the value. I could be doing ifs, or I could be doing a switch statement. So it ends up being something where I'm having to write quite a lot of code. So very much the theme for a lot of the stuff we're looking at today is how do I write less code? So in that theme, I can write a switch expression. So what that looks like is this. So I want to turn that direction into a vector 3. So I could go public, static, vector 3, and I could call this direction to vector. And then I say, well, what the input is, which is taking direction. And then I go, okay, direction, switch. So I'm telling it that this is something that is switching based upon that direction input. Then I don't write case or anything like that. I would go E direction, north, and then I would say, okay, well, that might be a new vector. Actually, I can just use cheat. I'm going to say that's a vector 3 forward. And then, okay, well, east might be a vector 3 right. South, well, that's a negative of vector 3 forward. And E direction west, well, that's a minus of vector 3 right. And what if something came in that was an unsupported direction somehow? And this could happen if I added in additional things like northeast, southeast, but I haven't configured it. What if I want to give a default? Well, I can do that. So if I do an underscore and then do the operator there, then I could actually have this do something where it could be, okay, well, throw a new, and I could throw a particular exception. So something like an argument out of range exception is probably a valid one. So I could say unknown direction, and then we just put a semicolon here. Now I have something that what I can do is I can just go, oh, so debug log, direction to vector, and I can just go north. And it will just give me back the vector 3 forward in this case, or if I gave it east, south, it would give me back the correct ones. So if you're wanting to set up translations between things, even if there's calculations and maths that's happening, you can set it up using this syntax, which is a lot simpler. It's a lot less code. And I missed, that shouldn't have had a semicolon there. So used to putting semicolons. So it's much cleaner syntax, much less code. And we can see that gave me back correctly the right value there. So these switch expressions are really, really handy if you're needing to do something where it is doing translations there, even if it's doing a bit of a calculation on the stuff, can be really useful. And we write it largely, the syntax is exactly like a function that we would have for the translation. So if you've already got functions that are doing the translation, it's actually not much to turn it into one of these switch expressions. It's very little actually, and what it will largely be is mostly you'll be deleting code. And it gives us something that makes our syntax in places really nice, really clean, and easy to work with. So that's something that I highly recommend having a look at. So dive in and experiment with these different things. We've seen a few different ones. We've seen stuff we can do so we can have properties that are visible in the inspector. We've seen how we can access stuff based on an offset from the end of an array or a list much more easily. We've seen easier ways of assembling strings and a couple of things that we can now do with switches that makes it a little bit simpler and cleaner for setting stuff up. And as I said, the focus with all of this is writing less code, and it's something I really want to encourage. It's one of the big things that helps with ensuring the quality of your code. Write less of it, because if you write less of it, you're able to get onto other stuff quicker, you're able to find problems quicker, you're able to debug things quicker. So solving problems in smaller amounts of code is going to be really beneficial. So these are all about ways of doing that. And also in many cases, because they're simpler, they're less code, we run into less problems because there's less space for those to hide. So dive in and experiment with them. See the kinds of things you can be doing there. If there's code you've got from the past that you want to update, it's a good chance to do that. It's always good to go through and look at potentially refreshing and updating code like of that, improving its robustness. And if it shrinks down the size of it, all the better. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you did, chuck in a like and subscribe, it really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and there's a link to that in the description below. There is also a link to the video archive where you'll be able to find this and all of the other tutorial videos. That's something you can search through based upon keywords in the descriptions, things like that. If you have any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's also a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.